Good morning. Thankful for the privilege to share a message from the Word of God with you. I encourage you to open your Bibles to Luke chapter 20, and we will experience Jesus this morning together. So far here in this section of Luke where Jesus has come to Jerusalem. People recognized him as coming in the name of the Lord. He's the King, the Messiah. Some people are recognizing that, and some are, of course, having great conflict with him, which is going to be part of what the lesson today is about as well. But one of the first things he did after he came to Jerusalem was to cleanse the temple, and again, that was a source of conflict where he was asserting his authority and foretelling his judgment upon Jerusalem and the corruption that was going on there. He was challenged then by the religious leaders there in Jerusalem, and he gave this parable of the vine growers that we studied together, showing how the people, God's chosen people, so often rejected the prophets and are even going to reject Jesus and kill him as the Son of God. Then there was the discussion of over paying taxes, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and render to God the things that are God's. The message, I believe, there is that we should be God's image on earth and not worrying so much about Caesar's image and those less important things. And so this same conversation really just continues in the portion of text we're going to look at this morning about the resurrection. Will there be a resurrection is the question that's most of this is about. So Jesus is engaging different sections of these religious leaders, so specifically the Sadducees are brought up in this discussion today. If we think about the points that we'll draw from here as we ask this question, will there be a resurrection? He has this interaction with the Sadducees versus the resurrection. They're sort of giving this reason why, this is foolishness. There can't be a resurrection. And then, of course, Jesus defends against that and shows that, in fact, the resurrection is a scriptural idea. And, of course, we know Jesus is the resurrection. And then he gives even another example furthering that idea to help establish this idea of the resurrection. Of course, jumping ahead, we know Jesus rises from the dead and illustrates that more fully, but at this point he's having these discussions. So let's jump into our text here. Let's read from Luke chapter 20, verses 27 through 47. I'll be reading from the Legacy Standard Bible here this morning. Luke 20, 27 through 47. Now some of the Sadducees, who say that there is no resurrection, came to him, and they questioned him, saying, "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, having a wife, and he is childless, his brother should marry the wife and raise up seed for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers, and the first married a wife and died childless, and the second and the third married her, and in the same way all 7 died, leaving no children. Finally, the woman died also. Therefore, this woman, in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? For all 7 had her as a wife." And Jesus said to them, "The sons of this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy to attain to that age and the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. For they cannot even die anymore, because they are like angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. But that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the burning bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Now he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him." And some of the scribes answered and said, "Teacher, you have spoken well." For they did not dare to question him any longer about anything. Then he said to them, "How is it that they say the Christ is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, until I put your enemies as a footstool for your feet." Therefore, David calls him Lord, so how is he his son? And while all the people were listening, he said to the disciples, "Beware of the scribes who want to walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses, and for appearance's sake offer long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation." So, this question that's throughout this text, will there be a resurrection? Now, we have hints from the Old Testament we can think about. Certainly we know where this is headed with Jesus and our hope of resurrection, but thinking about even in the Old Testament, Job says about himself, if you look back in Job chapter 19, as he's struggling through all these things, he says, "As for me, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will rise up over the dust of this world. Even after my skin is destroyed, yet from my flesh I shall behold God." So even Job, at the earlier time, had this idea that he would, after death, somehow be able to see God. And then, of course, we have the Psalms, which we're even quoting in our text here this morning, but from Psalm 16:10, where David writes here about the Holy One, he says, "For you will not forsake my soul to Sheol. You will not give your Holy One over to see corruption." Now we'll later see that applied to Jesus and how he isn't going to be in the grave and rot away, but rather he's going to rise from the dead. So there's these hints and ideas of resurrection in the Old Testament. We could look at Daniel and all of the different visions and things that go on in Daniel. Towards the end of the book, this is written. It says, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground," this is the idea of being dead, "many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to reproach and everlasting contempt." This idea of a resurrection of everybody, and there'd be a judgment after the resurrection. So these ideas were certainly in the minds of these Jewish people in the first century, fully aware of what the Old Testament had to say. There's a lot more we could look at in this way as well. But this gives us some context for those folks at that time. And even in the New Testament, jumping away from Luke for a moment, looking at the Gospel of John, John chapter 11, where Jesus tells Mary about her son, about her brother Lazarus who had passed away. He says that Lazarus will rise again, and then Mary responds to Jesus there, or rather Martha responds to Jesus in John 11:24. Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day," like what we read about in Daniel. We have this expectation of this resurrection to come. "I know that will happen. I believe that." But Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies." And of course he goes on then to actually raise Lazarus from the dead right then and there at that time. So Jesus has all authority over life and death, the resurrection, and all of these things. And so as we think about our context here in Luke and this conflict with the Sadducees and the resurrection, now even in our text as it tells us, perhaps Luke writing to predominantly Gentile people who maybe we don't know all of the ins and outs of the different Jewish sects, says here, "Now some of the Sadducees who say there is no resurrection." That's one of the things that characterizes the Sadducees compared to the Pharisees. And we have that little mnemonic that helps us remember that the Pharisees believe in the resurrection. That's fair, you see. And then the Sadducees do not believe in the resurrection, and that's sad, you see. That's just a mnemonic. That's not where those words come from, but helps us to keep track of these different groups. So they don't believe this idea that anyone could rise from the dead, and they don't even believe in the scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures beyond what Moses wrote. So those first 5 books of the Old Testament, we might call the Pentateuch, the Law of Moses, the Torah, we would just explicitly say Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those books are what the Sadducees believed, and all the rest, they just kind of rejected that. And they just followed what was in the Torah there. So these folks, from that perspective then, go on to say, and they're questioning him, questioning Jesus, saying, "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, having his wife, and he is childless, his brother should marry the wife and raise up seed for his brother." Now again, this is these folks who only believe in the law of Moses, and they're citing some things that are in the law of Moses. And they're discussing this idea of what some call a levirate marriage. It doesn't have anything to do with Levi, but it's this idea of a husband's brother, the situation where a husband's brother has a responsibility if the brother passes away. And that seems like a weird thing to us in our culture. Why would we marry our brother's wife and all this stuff? But this is actually from the law of Moses. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 25, you can see it outlined there. Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 and 6. If brothers live together and one of them dies and has no son, then the wife of the one who died shall not be married outside the family to some strange man, some random other. She's not like leaving the family and remarrying like we would maybe imagine in our culture. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to himself as wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it will be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of his dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. So the purpose there was to carry on the lineage. So that when a family would have their children, then each of those sons would be given a certain inheritance, and that's just the way that they had their whole system of land inheritance, and also just imagining who would come from those family lines and all of that was very important to them. And so the idea would be that if someone needed to step in, if a brother died, that sort of breaks the chain and messes up the inheritance rights. And so if that were to happen, then a younger brother who's not married would then marry that widow, and then the first son that would be born of that union would then be considered the dead brother's lineage and would get that inheritance. And then that family could continue, and there could be other children, and that would be part of the living brother's lineage. So very complicated to us, but that's the way they would think about it. And of course, we have occurrences we see about that in the Bible, like Genesis chapter 38, the situation where Judah had a son named and married Tamar, and then was very wicked, and somehow God killed him, and so Tamar was left as a widow. And so the next son, Onan, was given to her in fulfillment of this whole thing we read about in Deuteronomy. But Onan was also wicked, and the Lord killed him, and so Judah was supposed to give his next son, Shelah, to her, but never did to do that. And of course, all the chaos with Tamar and Judah, it's a whole other story. But we see that system of levirate marriage going on there, and also see something similar in Ruth chapter 4, where Boaz was the kinsman redeemer, and there was some other closer relative who was supposed to be the first to have the right to do that, and he declined, and that sort of thing. So you can see those principles throughout the Old Testament. But a woman who had 7 brothers as husbands, that's beyond anything we read about in the scriptures here. That's kind of ridiculous example. And there's actually, as I was reading a Catholic Bible here last year, I encountered a part of what they consider the scriptures that we do not consider the scriptures, but it's a historical writing which may have been what they had in mind here. There's the book of Tobit. And there's a woman named Sarah in this story where it says that she had been married to 7 husbands, and the wicked demon in this story, the wicked demon had killed each of them before they had been with her, as is customary for wives. So the female slave said to her, "You are the one who kills your husbands. See, you have already been married to 7 husbands and not borne the name of a single one of them." So this kind of a similar situation that may have been a piece of literature that they were familiar with and had read that. I'm not trying to suggest that Tobit is inspired. It's a fanciful story. Ultimately, another relative does come and marry this woman. His name is Tobias, and he breaks the curse with this demon from the advice of an angel by burning some fish guts. It's a very strange story, but just so you know, that was something that was written a couple hundred years before Jesus' time, so that may have been a popular piece of literature that would have been perhaps part of the basis of why these Sadducees were bringing up this story. And so, as we see what they bring up here in Luke 20, verse 29, it says, now there were 7 brothers, and the first married a wife and died childless, and the second, and the third, and so on and so on. Nobody had children in these marriages, right? Finally, the woman died also. So all 8 of these people have passed away. Therefore, this woman in the resurrection, because they're very skeptical, they don't believe in this. This is just a mockery. We're giving this ridiculous example to show how impractical and how this is not a true idea, so they thought. Whose wife will she be? For she had, all the 7 had her as a wife. So we can forget this crazy demon story in Tobit. This is a simpler scenario they're giving. There's just this normal marriage, and the husband died. All 7 of these brothers went through this levirate marriage process. But there's sort of a problem here. The Sadducees are suggesting, how can this work? Now, back in those days, even though from the very beginning God created man and woman, Adam and Eve, to be husband and wife, and that was how it's supposed to work, we know that there were situations where some men had multiple wives. That was never God's plan, but that was a common cultural thing that went on. But there was never any situation where a woman would have multiple husbands. That was not a thing at all. But that's sort of what's being proposed here, because if they're all risen from the dead and they're all together, they're all married, it's kind of a mess where this woman has, in a sense, 7 husbands. So the implication is, well, there's this whole idea of resurrection is silly and false. That's what the Sadducees are trying to imply here with their scenario. But of course, Jesus defends this idea of the resurrection. And in Matthew and Mark's accounts, he begins this discussion with a bit of a rebuke off the top. Matthew 22:29, Jesus answered and said to them, "You are mistaken, not understanding the scriptures, nor the power of God." So right off the bat, you guys are wrong. You're misunderstanding this. You think you're clever, but you're wrong. You're making a mockery of this hope of resurrection. And in Luke 20, verse 34, Jesus said to them, "The sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy to attain that age and the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage." So the sons of this age is just like what we see today. We're here on the earth and we're people and walking around, and some of us are married and that sort of thing. Back then, it talked about it a little differently. Or some are married and are given in marriage, referring to this idea of arranged marriages. A father would give away the daughter to be married. We still do that kind of symbolically in our weddings and that sort of thing. But that's the idea. There's just this practice of marriage, and that's part of life here on the earth. But contrasting to that, those who are worthy to attain to that age, or this age versus that age, there's a different thing. The resurrection, this future situation, it's different. They're not going to be practicing marriage. Marriage isn't going to be a thing in the way that we think about it today. They are neither married nor are given in marriage. And he goes on to elaborate on that in verse 36. "For they cannot even die anymore, because they are like angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection." So this idea of being like angels or sons of God, that they're immortal. Part of the reason we have marriage is to be fruitful and multiply, because we all know that each of us is going to pass away and there's another generation and that sort of thing. But in the resurrection, there's no more death. So we're not replacing populations anymore as we are in this earth. You might even think about the idea of how the church is the bride of Christ. And that's going to be a bigger picture idea of unity that will become more realized and understood in the resurrection, that certainly is true today as well, but it may become more of a focus and more obvious about what that means. When we think about those purposes of marriage kind of go away. Even the idea of companionship that we may think of the purpose of marriage, have this perfect unity with the saints and with God, and the idea even of desires of the flesh that perhaps would be part of marriage, those things are no more as we're changed in the resurrection. So it's hard for us to imagine all that, but that seems to be the idea here. And Paul even talks about some of those things about our change of our bodies. In 1 Corinthians 15, really that whole chapter is worth looking at for this topic. I'll just read a little piece of it here. In 1 Corinthians 15:51, "Behold, I tell you a mystery," something that needs to be revealed, right? "We will not all sleep," meaning die, right? "But we will all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we will be changed." From these fleshly, sinful bodies into these spiritually focused bodies that we don't have the ability to sin. So that'll be a good change, something we're looking forward to in the resurrection. So he goes on here to give more proof of resurrection, besides just to say that we are like angels and not like our bodies today. He goes on in verse 37 to further this point. "But that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the burning bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. And now he is not the God of the dead, but of the living. For all live to him." So if you think back to that scene with the burning bush, where Moses noticed that burning bush, and then God called him to him from the burning bush, from the midst of that flame that wasn't consuming. It wasn't just a regular fire, it was the presence of God. He told him to remove his sandals because you're walking on holy ground. And there in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 6, he said also, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And so this is that context where this is said, where Jesus is quoting from here. He didn't say, a long time ago, Abraham was around, and Isaac was around, and Jacob was around. Back then when they were alive, I was their God, but not anymore. They're dead. He said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham. I am the God of Abraham. I am the God of Isaac. I am the God of Jacob." They at this time in Exodus 3:6 had passed away, but God is currently and actively then and now the God of these people. These people may have physically died, but their spirits continue to live on. They are asleep, as some passages use this idea of sleeping. In John chapter 5, Jesus has some things to say about this coming resurrection, which fits with what Daniel wrote as well. John 5:28, "Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming in which all who are in the tombs will hear his voice, and will come forth, those who did good deeds to a resurrection of life, and those who committed the evil deeds to the resurrection of judgment." Sometimes we don't think about the resurrection on both sides of that, but everybody will be risen from the dead at Christ's return. As the writer of Hebrews wrote in Hebrews 9:27, "Inasmuch as it is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes the judgment." And there's resurrection to a judgment. It's either decision, this judgment leads to this reward, or this judgment leads to a condemnation. So what are the reactions of our friends here to this? So we have a reaction from the scribes in Luke 20, verse 39. "And some of the scribes answered and said, 'Teacher, you have spoken well.' For they did not dare to question him any longer about anything. Now it gets a little confusing, all these different groups. There's the scribes and Pharisees and the Sadducees. As I mentioned, once Jesus came to Jerusalem, in Luke's account, he doesn't mention explicitly the Pharisees by that word anymore. But a lot of times the scribes and Pharisees are kind of lumped together. And so this perhaps is a reference to the Pharisees. And of course the Pharisees, as the mnemonic goes, right, it's fair you see that they believe in the resurrection. So they may have been pleased with some of these things he was saying about the resurrection. And teacher, you have spoken well, because we agree with you about the resurrection. But they're also recognizing that he is a master of these things. He's a master of the scriptures. He has irrefutable logic, and so they're going to get in trouble to try to argue with him anymore. So I think we're perhaps mistaken to think, well, these scribes are all good with him now. They're all friends now. They've converted to Jesus. I don't think that's what we're to understand at all. In fact, he gives this riddle now next about the Messiah and seems to be directing it to them, to the scribes. So now, since he's addressing the scribes, perhaps the Pharisees, he doesn't have to limit himself to Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy anymore, because the scribes and Pharisees take a broader view on those things. So here in Luke chapter 20, verse 41, then he said to them, how is it that they say the Christ, or the Messiah, is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies as a footstool for your feet. Now, that's all a little confusing to me. There's, who's talking to whom, and there's Lord and this Lord and that Lord, and it gets a little confusing. If we go back to where David writes this in Psalm 110, Psalm 110 is where this is cited from, we can get a little clearer perspective. So we see here in the translation of the Greek, the Lord said to my Lord, it's the same word. It's a little confusing. But if we look at Psalm 110 in the Hebrew translated, we see there's two words there, Yahweh or Jehovah or Lord in all capital letters, perhaps in your translation. Yahweh says to my Lord, to my master, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies as a footstool for your feet. So we have to think about the idea that the Jewish people widely understood that this Messiah to come was a son of David. That was widely understood. So David is here speaking, and as we think about David writing this, or speaking this, so to speak, we can think about David's God, Yahweh, the Lord, the all caps Lord. He's reporting to address David's master, David's Lord, lowercase Lord, perhaps. And so God says to that Lord, that superior person to David, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies as a footstool for your feet. Now, that thought can be a little confusing. The question he asks then, well, therefore David calls him Lord, so how is he his son? So how can this passage be both about this son of David and also about David's superior? We don't, especially in that culture, no one would think of their son or any descendant of them as their greater. They always look to their ancestor. Father Abraham, or Moses, look back to these people of history as the great superior person. But David is writing about some descendant in the future from him as being this superior person. So how can that make any sense? And Jesus doesn't answer this question. He just leaves it hanging here. There's no answer in the text, but we understand that Jesus is the Messiah, and that's how it makes sense. Jesus is of the line of David. We've even seen that in Luke through his genealogies. He is the son of David, according to the flesh, so to speak, but he's also David's superior. He's the everlasting God. And we can see a passage like Philippians chapter 2, where Paul writes here in Philippians 2:9, therefore, God also exalted him, Jesus, and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee will bow, of those who are in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and that every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So Jesus is the King, and this applies, thinking about David, even to those under the earth. David, as a person who has passed away and is buried in the grave, even David will bow. Every tongue will confess and every knee will bow that Jesus Christ is Lord. And this is all to the glory of God the Father. But the scribes aren't teaching all this. Maybe the scribes and Pharisees agree with this concept of a resurrection being a future hope. They aren't teaching any of this about Jesus. They're opposing Jesus. And so his conclusion to the scribes, or about the scribes, is don't listen to the scribes. They're trouble. He goes on here in verse 45, and while all the people were listening, he said to the disciples, verse 46, beware of the scribes who want to walk around in long robes and love greetings at marketplaces and the best seats at the synagogues and place of honor at the banquets. They want to be, the fancy, smart person, the important person, the person everybody looks up to, and that sort of thing. But in reality, in verse 47, they're the ones who devour widows' houses. They're ripping people off. And for appearance sake, they offer the long prayers. They're just speaking vain repetitions and just making a big show of what they're doing in order for people to think that they're so great. These will receive greater condemnation. Teachers have responsibility, and these teachers were false teachers. These people were phonies and fake. They like to be fancy and seem important, but they were missing the whole point. They were looked to by the regular folks as the leaders and the ones with the answers about the scriptures, but they were missing the whole point of the scriptures. The Old Testament scriptures were pointing to this Messiah to come, and that Messiah to come was there. It's Jesus, and they were rejecting him. There he is in front of them, and they're rejecting Jesus. So, will there be a resurrection? Yes, there will. Jesus is the resurrection. And this conflict with the Sadducees versus the Sadducees versus this idea of the resurrection, they thought they were clever, but Jesus had a better answer as he defended the resurrection. He explains that we'll be like the angels and not even have marriage anymore to destroy their silly argument that they had against the resurrection. And he goes on to provide more proof, kind of going on the offensive, not the defensive anymore, talking about how the patriarchs who have physically died actually live on. God is their God even today, and that they will rise again. And then he went on to talk about this riddle about the Messiah. Jesus is both the descendant of David in the flesh, but he's also the eternal God. So don't listen to the scribes, because they just think they're fancy, but they don't really even know what's going on. Beware of their deception. So we'll leave you with verse 1 of our Psalm 110 that was quoted there in our passage. I use this to help us see the clarity between the two different words for Lord here. Yahweh, the God of Israel, right? Yahweh says to my Lord, David speaking, Yahweh says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies as a footstool for your feet. Of course, that's talking about Jesus. Jesus is reigning now at the right hand of the Father. We understand that. But we're still waiting for his return. He lets the wickedness go on that we see round about us in the world. He is seeking those who will worship him. But there will come a day where all of that will end, and he'll come to judge the world. And there will no longer be anyone opposing him, and that will be the point where the enemies are a footstool. Jesus taught us to pray, and a lot of times we get a little gun-shy of Jesus' example prayer in Matthew 6:10, where he said, Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And certainly Jesus is reigning in heaven now, which proves that his kingdom has come. His kingdom has been instituted. But his kingdom will be consummated and fully come upon his return, and all the enemies will be made a footstool for his feet. And then in the new heavens and the new earth, God's will be completely done on that new earth as it is done in heaven now, where there will be no more sin or death or pain or crying, and we will be forever with the Lord. And so the question for each of us is, are we ready for that day? Are we ready for the day of the return of the Lord? Jesus said quite simply in Mark 16:16, "He who believes and has been baptized shall be saved, but he who has disbelieved shall be condemned." Have you done that? Are you living a faithful life? Are we conforming ourselves to the image of the Son? Are there any things you need this morning? Support from the church, prayers, or to be immersed into Christ? Anything that you might need, we want to help you and invite you to do that, to ask for that. We're going to sing number 304, "Why Do You Wait?" If you need to come to the Lord, we encourage you not to wait any longer. Come as we stand and sing the song.